Good afternoon, everyone. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm Director of the European Studies Center here at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm pleased to welcome you to our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Spring Lecture, although it's not quite spring here yet, but it is spring semester, which is part of our ongoing Year of Creating Europe series. There will be time for Q&A after the talk, and you can feel free to put any questions in the chat or at the Q&A at any point during or after the talk, and I will do my best to get to as many of these as I can. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Megan Brown, who is an assistant professor of history at Swarthmore College. She received her PhD in 2017 from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and an MA from the University of London Institute in Paris in 2010. Her work has appeared in modern and contemporary France and French politics, culture and society, in French politics, culture and society, and her book, The Seventh Member State, France, Algeria, and the European Project, from which today's talk draws, is currently under contract and will come out next year. Research for this manuscript was supported by the Fulbright and the Council for European Studies, among other sources. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so much. So I will try sharing my screen. I really appreciate this invitation. Let's see. Oh, I think that works. Great. I really appreciate this invitation. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to JJ. It feels really fitting to be speaking a week after that fascinating talk on Brexit, because in some ways I might characterize my work as being about an earlier European exit. So I'll begin with 37-year-old Hanover-born Gerd Wolfgang Fiege, who began working in Algeria in the early 1950s. 8 years later, polio left him wheelchair-bound, and it was 1959. The Social Security office in Oran in northwest Algeria began paying him a disability pension. And 3 years later, in 1962, Algeria gained its independence from France. Fiege soon returned to West Germany, where he demanded his pension there on the basis of rights guaranteed by the European Economic Community, or EEC. The Berlin Federal Insurance Agency, where Fiege lodged his claim, balked, given Algeria's status as an independent and obviously non-European state. It eventually transmitted the request to an agency in Strasbourg, where Fiege had worked for 2 years prior to his move to Algeria. And Strasbourg also refused. His case appealed up to the European Court of Justice, based in Luxembourg, and there, in 1973, the British Advocate General Jean-Pierre Warner argued on Fiege's behalf in a case that would create precedent for the EEC to recognize employment in Algeria as eligible for a European pension. Making the case for Fiege, Warner declared, quote, "The aftermath of empire has brought, for those of our countries that were formerly imperial powers, liabilities of many kinds which, whilst unwelcome, are for one reason or another inescapable." What did Warner mean by inescapable, unwelcome liabilities? What did the aftermath of empire, or even empire itself, have to do with one polio survivor's financial security? Why was the European Court of Justice discussing Algeria at all? My brief answer is that the European Court of Justice was concerned with Algeria because for nearly 5 years, and I will contend to a more limited degree for another 14 beyond that, Algeria was in the European Economic Community. The title of my book, The Seventh Member State, France, Algeria, and the European Project, perhaps provocatively implies that rather than celebrating the 6 founding states of the EEC, so Belgium, Italy, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany, and they're known as the 6, we must instead consider that 7th entity at both the margins and the center of integration debates, Algeria. As I will show, Algeria was literally inscribed in the EEC because French officials insisted it be named in the community's foundational text, the Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957. What does it mean for the history of European integration or this contemporary moment of European affairs? A study of Algeria's inclusion in and then slow extraction from the EEC, one of the most important precursors to today's European Union, challenges traditional readings of the process of post-war unification, rewriting the geography of Europe and complicating the timeline of decolonization itself. So I am arguing that the shape of integrated Europe was far less certain in the decades after World War II, and that its form came about because individual states most consequentially, France, attempted to bend its form to suit their national and critically imperial imperatives. There was nothing natural or predetermined about what states could or could not be included in this Europe. And long before the Copenhagen criteria laid out rules for how states might accede to the EU, European lawmakers worried less about keeping so-called non-Europeans out than they did about upholding empire and maintaining their global sovereignty. So my talk today focuses on material mainly found in the last 2/3 of my book, whose tentative table of contents you can see here. So I'll briefly summarize that first third that I won't really be touching on. In the first chapter, I introduced the longer history of dreams of integrated Europe, read in tandem with the emergence of an interwar ideology known as Eurafrica, which idealized Europe and Africa as a fused continent or geopolitical sphere. And the second chapter focuses on French imperial reform after World War II, and also looks at those early post-World War II attempts at integration, really that sort of glimmer. These two chapters emphasize how French officials envisioned empire alongside or with a unifying Europe. Now, my contribution to the field is to tell Algeria's part in this history, which is typically minimized in favor of the associated African states and Madagascar, which were 18 independent states that signed the first Yaoundé Convention with the EEC in 1963. And I won't really be talking about those states today, but I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. So after chapter 2, my book really turns towards the post-war European project. Not incidentally, and this might be familiar for some of you as well, I first learned about European integration on a field trip to the Jean Monnet house in Yvelines when I was a study abroad student. And there I learned a familiar history in which the founders of Europe secured peace and rescued their economies through integration. And that gets us cheery images like this one. For accessibility purposes, I'll try to offer a brief description of the images I'm showing today. So this image is a very upbeat political cartoon showing the 6's foreign ministers hand in hand, the Benelux states are little children, just food for thought, boarding a ship named Europa, presumably to cruise together towards prosperity. But unspoken in the celebratory narrative is the reality that 4 of the 6 founding members still held former colonies or administered UN trust territories at the time that they formed the EEC. So typical for a historian of European integration, I conducted research for my project at France's diplomatic archives and at the historical archives of the European Union, which are located in Florence, Italy, and thankfully, now due to the pandemic, there are really incredible digitized archives, including some right here at Pitt. Less typically, however, I also rely heavily on France's overseas archives, because whereas most historians of integrated Europe do not really address the larger imperial context at all, I contend that imperial concerns, and particularly anxieties about Algeria, were central to Europe's formation. For those of you who come from a European integration studies background, here are some dates that should be pretty familiar, and I just have a small timeline here. I'm highlighting the 2 foundational treaties of 1951 and 1957, the first enlargement in the early 1970s, and also in 1954, the failure of the European defense community. And I'm also not talking much about the EDC, and I'm not addressing Euratom at all, but I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. And there will not be a test, and I will have some reminders of these timelines in the slides to come, so no need to memorize these dates. We have much to gain if we recall that the milestones I have up here occurred contemporaneously to several critical moments in the history of France's empire. So if we consider these events together, and I'm overlaying now this integration timeline with just a small selection of key dates in the history of French Empire, we are confronted with exciting and as of now under-examined questions about how these histories impacted one another. And these are the questions that are central to my book. So, how could Algeria be considered a part of Europe? France began its conquest of Algeria in 1830, and 18 years later, in 1848, with most of the region subdued, the French government chose to organize the northern part of Algeria as administratively akin to the departments of continental France itself. And département is roughly speaking the equivalent of a French state. So we see here a map showing France and Algeria, and they're sharing that same bolded border, suggesting that they are a part of the same geopolitical entity. This decision was moved in part by the already sizable European settler population, as well as French business interests in the region. So this is important to really emphasize. Algeria was not considered a colony. Rather, it was Algérie française, French Algeria, understood to be the extension of metropolitan France across the Mediterranean. Yet, for local populations of Algeria, citizenship was difficult, if not impossible, to attain. Tensions flared at various points, and finally, in 1954, the Algerian War of Independence broke out. And after nearly 8 years of an extremely brutal war that followed, in 1962, Algeria won its independence. So unsurprisingly, anti-imperial nationalists such as the victorious National Liberation Front, or FLN, contended that Algeria had been a colony, not France itself. Their whole point was that they were emphasizing that Algeria was not France. Maybe surprisingly, the French state also embraced this sort of rewriting of history, and they did so as a way of moving past the shame of the war and to recast France as a continental European power. And this recasting ignored decades, even centuries, of celebrations of imperial grandeur. This memory of decolonized Algeria, rather than the more complex history of an Algeria extracted from France, has only been challenged by historians in the past 15 years, most famously by Todd Shepard. I argue in my book that Algeria's peculiar status as a part of France and the French state's desperate attempts to maintain sovereignty there profoundly impacted the progress of European integration. So we might consider this history in 3 stages as I'm breaking it down in this slide, and this is sort of the directions my talk will be going today. First, we see Algeria's initial exclusion from the coal and steel community in 1951, but quickly imperial anxieties led French officials to really do an about-face and demand Algeria's naming in the EEC Treaty of 1957. As a result of this, for nearly 5 years, French Algeria was a part of the EEC, specifically thanks to provisions laid out in the treaty's Article 227. In this period, the limits of France's commitment to securing actual benefits of European membership for Algerian goods or people were on full display. Finally, Algeria's independence in 1962 launched its slow exit from the EEC, a process that was only completed in 1976 when Algerian officials signed a new accord with the now expanded Europe of 9. So this underscores the longue durée nature of decolonization, in which the end of imperial relations cannot be reduced to a single Independence Day. Now, at first glance, a study of Algeria in the EEC may appear to be an account of the potential of an expansive Europe, inclusive of empire. But when we dig deeper, it is also a reckoning of a European inability or unwillingness to think and act creatively when officials found their sovereignty threatened by their fellow Europeans, and worse still, by former colonial subjects. This is a story of futures that were not realized and possibilities that were abandoned. European officials struggled to justify denying rights to Algeria, but ultimately barred Algerians from a European rights regime and cut Algeria out of European institutions. These moves were undergirded by often unspoken racist and Islamophobic assumptions about who could be called European. And this excision began even before Algeria's independence and allows us to trace the hardening of borders and the construction of an exclusionary Europe. Now you can see this slide. So to sort of turn to this first phase. On May 9th, 1950, now commemorated as Europe Day, French Foreign Affairs Minister Robert Schuman declared an address that jump-started European integration. In what would turn out to be a highly consequential remark, he invoked a shared European responsibility to develop Africa. 2 weeks later, he infamously declared that France would bring, and this is a quote, as a dowry, both its industry and Africa's market, And diplomatic historians know that marriage is a very popular metaphor. With Schumann's comment, the possibility that the French Union, as the empire was known after World War II, might be a part of integrated Europe had been raised, and this avenue towards future partnership remained open and contested for decades to come. Despite Schumann's offer of Africa, the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1951, created the European Coal and Steel Community, a body whose borders were explicitly continental. French authorities were eager to keep it so, in no small part because they wanted to keep Italian firms away from Algerian iron mines. They also feared and did not see a purpose to sharing their overseas sovereignty. Given this period's proximity to World War II, we should not be surprised that in particular, French observers disdained the notion of sharing imperial riches with Germans, who they feared would muscle in on French sovereignty in Africa, as we see in this newspaper illustration from 1953, which literally shows a bulky, mean-looking German shoving a surprised little Frenchman to the side as they both walk on the African continent. So in general, I have found very little concern or even mention from the French sources about Algeria's exclusion from the coal and steel community, despite its peculiar and close juridical relationship with continental France. One major exception is the Algerian senator Abdenour Tamzali, who decried the decision just months after the coal and steel community came into being. In a striking rebuke of Schumann, Tamzali railed against Algerians becoming, and here I'm quoting him, concubines, as France entered into a marriage of convenience with the other members of the Six. So this is Tamzali, a photo from his years in the Senate. He warned, our constituents will not easily understand why their territory is placed outside of the coal and steel pool like a poor second-rate relation. His assessment of the coal and steel community and its tacit repudiation of Algeria's juridical status foreshadowed the debates that would soon plague the Six. In the months and years after, French authorities continued to puzzle over how the whole of the French Union, again, the moniker of the empire after World War II, would fit alongside or within European institutions. Notably, one of the arguments against the failed European defense community, killed by the French National Assembly in 1954, was that it would divert the French army from its duties protecting, i.e. attempting to maintain control over the colonies. Within months of the EDC's failure, however, the FLN launched the Algerian War of Independence. By early spring of 1956, so 2 years later, Indochina, Morocco, and Tunisia had all celebrated their independence from France, and the Algerian War had become more violent. And importantly, a glimmer of disapproval was growing in the continental French populace. This timing overlapped with the renewed negotiations for the European Common Market. French officials in Paris and Brussels began to consider how European integration could serve as a tool, even a weapon, in the fight against Algerian nationalists. French Overseas Minister Gaston Defferre, and this is a photo of him, argued that the EEC must include the whole of the French Union, forming a Euro-African common market. In other words, including the empire in Europe should be a non-negotiable for the French. Defferre took his idea to French Foreign Minister Christian Pinot, and he insisted to Pinot that French colonial concerns should fall within the purview of United Europe as associated states, which would secure economic and aid links. France, Defferre argued, and I'm quoting, cannot sacrifice its African vocation for its European vocation. Such a sacrifice would lead to, and I'm quoting again, political secession, which, in thinking about these recent independences, was not a small fear. Pinot took heed and made the association of the French Union part of the French list of demands on the Six. Soon, however, Pinot announced a second, even more consequential non-negotiable. Algeria should be named in the treaty. The drive to name Algeria derived from specific fears about international opinion regarding the ongoing crisis in Algeria and from anxiety over the Suez crisis, with French officials looking now to regain some control over what they dubbed the Mediterranean region. This was a much bigger step than simple association. Algeria's naming would make it a part of the common market. Months earlier, one economic affairs official had opined that were France to demand for Algeria the types of measures targeting underdeveloped European regions, such as the Italian Mezzogiorno, I'm quoting, "It would be hard to imagine that the European partners could validly justify a refusal of admission to Algeria." He was right. The six could not refuse, although it was less on the grounds of legal language and more because they were so desperate for the French to sign the treaty. After the French quashing of the European defense community in 1954, appeasing the French now appeared more crucial than ever to secure future unification projects. So Algerian nationalists, for their part, largely ignored the ongoing process in Brussels. Rather, the National Liberation Front and other anti-imperial organizations launched a highly visible and eventually successful campaign in a different venue, the United Nations. By February of 1957, the UN General Assembly held its first discussion of the conflict. And here we see Pinot on the left and two members of another anti-imperial group, the MNA, at the UN on the right. The attention paid by the UN, an international venue that increasingly appeared hostile to European colonialism, threatened French authority in Algeria because it drew embarrassing attention to the conflict there. Less than 1 week after the General Assembly opened debate on the Algerian question, as it was called, Defer and Pinot ramped up their demands on the six and called for the explicit naming of Algeria in the EEC treaty. Unlike in the United Nations, where the Algerian cause eventually won the diplomatic revolution, to invoke Matthew Connolly, in Brussels, France scored a temporary victory. Indeed, when we examine France's approach to the Treaty of Rome negotiations, we might consider it to be a diplomatic counter-revolution. So, why did the French make this demand? If Algeria appeared in the Common Market Treaty, the French could answer anti-colonial voices in the United Nations and elsewhere with the affirmation of 5 European states who acknowledged France's claim to Algeria. This would do potentially very little to actually change, let alone improve, Algeria's economic situation. That didn't stop, however, some members of the six from grousing about footing the bill for France's empire. So here we see a political cartoon of the French Marianne encouraging the German Mickel to dump millions of Deutschmarks into a roaring fire labeled North Africa. Yes, the caption really was, "Close your eyes and think of Europe." In reality, despite these German fears, the final result was anything but economically secure for Algeria in terms of real economic gain. Its agricultural products, notably wine and citrus, would continue to be excluded from the new preferential regime, and Algerian workers would be unlikely to be included in the easing up of labor migration. Notably, however, French authorities cast the metropole, continental France, as the region that would be suffering from this uneven application of the treaty. And in denying Algeria full benefits through the common market, the French thus reaffirmed Algeria's inferior status and positioned Algerian workers as people unworthy of full European rights, all while bolstering France's claim of sovereignty over the warring region. I'm sure you hear those sirens, a little Philadelphia ambiance for all of you. Wait a second. So, on March 25th, 1957, representatives of the six signed the Treaty of Rome. Eager to see France sign, its partners agreed to stipulations that would associate the French Union, again, France's empire, along with other colonial holdings. Most consequentially, Article 227 delineated where the Treaty of Rome would apply, including that some agricultural regulations, the liberalization of services, and the movement of goods would apply to Algeria and the French overseas departments once the treaty entered into force. Algeria was officially a part of the EEC. The Treaty of Rome marked a new era in European integration, celebrated in this poster on the right, which features allegorical figures of lovely European ladies holding hands. And we know that they're the six because their flags are their skirts. And it also includes a quote from the late Italian statesman de Gasperi, rejoicing about the lowering of borders. The less colorful image on the left is of the actual signing ceremony. Bureaucracy is not actually very photogenic, although I think the fresco definitely makes me long for a vacation in Europe, but looking at these images so clearly focused on Europe and Europeans, we might forget that due to French pressure, the Treaty of Rome included Algeria within its geographic reach. So what? For nearly 5 years, the European Economic Community stretched to Algérie française, with concrete ramifications for Algeria, France, and the Six that extended beyond that half decade. The application of the Treaty of Rome in Algeria stood to alter trade practices, offer monetary aid, and open labor circulation between Europe and Algeria. This served French interests in two key ways. First, it allowed officials to maintain that Algeria was a juridical part of France. Second, it opened an avenue for French officials to demand EEC financial support for costly Algerian development projects, which were understood in part as remedies for the ills that instigated the war in the first place. In practice, French officials' continued insistence that Algeria was a part of integrated Europe invited a new round of criticism from their partners. Dutch and West German officials recoiled at the price tag of development aid. Italians balked at the risk of competition from Algerian exports, agricultural and human. And the French, for their part, were still unafraid of antagonizing their partners in order to secure material support for French projects in Algeria. The question remained not whether Europe would be involved in Africa, but how. So here we might look at these allegorical ladies, the Six, look at where they're standing and notice that their kitten heels are masking North Africa if we take this poster's geography seriously. So here I'm overlaying the poster with a Google map of Europe and North Africa, and we see that the ladies are perched on the Maghreb. Now, surely the poster's illustrator did not mean to do this, but I think it is useful to notice this unintentionally accurate depiction of the EEC's reach. Since the interwar celebrations of Eurafrica, geographic logics have undergirded visions of European-African relations. In 1959, a French magazine treated its readers to one such geography lesson, and I'm quoting, "The distance is not further between Luxembourg and Algeria than between Naples and Amsterdam." The official who made this claim warned, quote, "In any event, it is important not to commit the error of considering Algeria as a far-off overseas territory merely associated with the EEC. Algeria must be considered the youngest of these adolescent regions of the community." Proclaimed shortly before Charles de Gaulle's appeal for Algerian self-determination, this claim and the work of French bureaucrats in Brussels to tie Algeria even closer to European institutions seem to suggest be a willfully blind optimism or a deeply confused atmosphere among those French administrators. In fact, a third reading of their actions and rhetoric is in order. For French officials, it still appeared advantageous to insist that Algeria benefit from EEC membership, regardless of the changing fortunes of Algérie française. Generally, in my research, I found that what initially appeared to be confusion or even chaos on the part of French and European bureaucracy had a calculated basis. And in this case, even for officials who acknowledged Algeria might soon gain independence, they did not envision the near wholesale exit of the settler population or a French business interest from the region. Thus, they continued to fight for the EEC to serve French interests in Algeria, even if they believed that Algeria might not always be a part of France. Debates in Brussels about how to apply EEC regulations to Algeria proved perplexing because of the delays built into the treaty and because of complications about Algeria's status. So for those of you who are familiar with French colonial administration, this is because at points in this process, Algeria was erroneously labeled as a French overseas territory. And again, I would question the degree to which that was an actual error or something more calculated. France's representative to the EEC, Éric de Carbonel, offered a novel solution for sidestepping the pitfalls of how to label Algeria. He suggested, and here he is, that, and I'm quoting, "The problem of application domain as it concerns Algeria can be treated by preterition." So I'm stumbling over that word because while we know not to pepper talks with dictionary definitions, this word preterition was entirely new to me when I stumbled upon Carbonel's telegram in the French diplomatic archives. It is the rhetorical device of omission or feigning omission, an argumentative logic that perhaps he learned in lycée as part of public speaking expose exercises. Carbonell implied that by not addressing Algeria outright, or by insisting that Algeria as a part of the French Republic need not be explicitly addressed, the French could tacitly create a legal environment in which their partners would accept the increasingly untenable claim to Algeria's Frenchness. Without saying a thing, Algeria would be integrated into the EEC. So while they never implemented this tactic, the argumentative style of absence appealed to French officials in Brussels because it enabled them to sidestep looming questions about Algeria's status. To give just one example of the conflicts that arose after the Common Market came into effect at the start of 1958, French officials quickly reversed on their earlier indications of what sources of funding they would tap for Algeria. This outraged the Italians, whose underemployed population was set to benefit from free labor mobility thanks to the EEC and to bilateral accords with some members of the Six. Italy's representative in Brussels pointedly reminded his French counterpart that were Algerians to access the European Social Fund, it would reduce the expected advantages for Italians. Italy's labor minister was, quote, concerned about the extension of the free circulation of labor regulations to Algeria and to Algerians. The evolution of events makes him fear the arrival in Europe of many Muslim individuals who can compete with the Italian workforce, even in northern Italy. So although I have emphasized the symbolic value of naming Algeria for the French, here we see the economic uses of its inclusion, much to the chagrin of the Italian delegation. Eventually, however, France's Algerian affairs minister recommended delaying the extension of free labor movement and the applicability of the social fund to Algeria until the end of 1963, which we know now would have been after independence. That they caved underscores the French equivocating about the rights actually owed to Algerian people. The awkward encounter between French and Italian officials suggests that Algeria's exact status in the EEC was unclear, and perhaps we could say ambivalent, from the Treaty of Rome signing until Algeria's independence in 1962. Nevertheless, it is crucial to acknowledge that for nearly 5 years, Algeria was fused both to France and to the EEC, rendering it a part of integrated Europe, however amorphous that membership was. So now we get to Algeria's independence and the next stage of its EEC history. I really love these two images. The bottom is actually not from independence. It's an anniversary celebration in November 61, commemorating the launch of the war. And that image shows children waving the Algerian flag. The top is an independence celebration, July of 1962, with an overjoyed young woman hanging out of the window of a car, also waving the flag. Mere months after these independence celebrations, in December of 1962, the Algerian head of state, Ahmed Ben Bella, alerted the EEC that, and I'm quoting a telegram that he sent, his government intended to inquire what the possible future relations between Algeria and the community will be. Despite Algeria's independence, Ben Bella signaled that the Algerian government was poised to claim a privileged economic and political position vis-a-vis Europe. This would be possible because of French officials' 1957 insistence that Algeria be named in the Treaty of Rome. So this is just one example of this new stage of diplomacy. It's a telegram from Algeria's foreign minister alerting European officials in early 1963 that a negotiator would be in Brussels the next day. And for those of you who are less familiar with what bureaucratic archives look like, this is a fairly good representation of a lot of my source material. Now, Ben Bella's query, and really these notes afterwards, they sent a wave of concern through the Six. And here Ben Bella is. His letter in brief sparked an incredible amount of paperwork in Brussels, with EEC members struggling to agree even on an appropriate response. The move by Algerians to insert themselves into a state of affairs from which the French had summarily excluded them for half a decade threatened France's privileged and self-proclaimed place at the helm of European African affairs writ large. It also meant that when the French tried to leverage Algeria's unclear EEC status to their own material benefit, They had to answer not just to the other members of the Six, but to the Algerian government itself. If de Gaulle's 1963 veto of Britain is the better known rejection of a Europe beyond the continent, it was the plodding extraction of Algeria from Europe that revealed that the shape integrated Europe took was an invention in and of itself, though an invention that would come to be viewed as natural and evident in the decades to come. After July 1962, the French tactic of demanding Algeria's naming in the Treaty of Rome now appeared to be both a liability and a promise. On the one hand, as one official wrote, it was, quote, obviously absurd to suggest that Algeria might become the seventh member of the European community. And there's the title of my book. On the other hand, considering that Algeria was explicitly named in the treaty, it was not clear just what else Algeria might be. So in my book, I discuss the savvy nature of independent Algeria and negotiation tactics. The new government was able to take advantage of their unclear position in Europe to secure guarantees about tariffs and aid. But they also leveraged power by threatening to boycott states that signed accords with Israel, and they solidified ties with global South states, the US and the USSR alike. But for the sake of time, I'm going to maintain my focus on French officials here, but I'll just emphasize that we really must be critical of their characterizations of Algerian officials as dull or greedy, when in reality they were shrewd tacticians who understood how to use international relations to their own benefit. 1 month after Algeria's independence, in August of 1962, France's representative in Brussels, the career diplomat Jean-Marc Boignet, pictured here with Foreign Minister Coupe de Morville, opined to his superiors in Paris that, quote, the accession of independence of this country, Algeria, must not, it seems to me, have the effect of depriving it of the benefits of inter-community preference. This matched what another official had told him, quote, if need be, underline that it would be premature and hardly opportune to change anything in the current situation. Boignet noted that the European Commission itself had deemed it, quote, juridically possible not to consider Algeria a third country. And third country is a European institutional way of denoting a state or territory outside of the EEC's purview. So in this way, French officials bought time to decide how to tackle the Algerian question without denying the new state and the remaining French business interests there the potential of continued EEC membership benefits. By March of 1963, 3 months after Ben Bella sent his telegram, the Six agreed to maintain what was called the status quo, in which independent Algeria would come to enjoy would continue to enjoy the same preferential tariff rates, migrant social security regime, and customs regulations that it did when it was a juridical part of France. This agreement was tenuous and subject to constant challenges from some members of the Six. The Dutch, most notably, began to subject Algerian goods to third country tariffs. French officials in the foreign ministry and elsewhere, for their part, opted for tactics of ambiguity or delay to avoid making a decision that would jeopardize French access to Algerian markets or to alienate their European partners. In 1964, an Algerian delegation in Brussels called for a preferential accord between Algeria and the EEC, demanding professional training for Algerian workers, guarantees of technical assistance, and financial aid. Before Algeria's independence, its workers, and I'm quoting their demands here, considered like French nationals, enjoyed advantages such as social security and family allowances, but, and I'm quoting here again, the accession to independence modified the situation, thus posing problems. EEC officials brushed off the Algerian demands, and French officials viewed Algeria's overtures in Brussels to be, quote, somewhat naive. In what reads almost as an episode of diplomatic gaslighting, these officials acted as if Algerians had no leg to stand on when demanding rights, and as if they never had. Nevertheless, EEC officials were at a loss as to how to create a firm break with Algeria. The status quo, in particular regarding trade, trundled on to a degree for years to come. So I want to emphasize how drawn out that process was. On April 26, 1976, EEC member states and Algerian representatives signed the cooperation agreement between the European Economic Community and the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria, with each government ratifying that in the coming months. And here we see the cover of the over 100-page agreement. From 1957, when Algeria was named in the Treaty of Rome, Until this date in 1976, nearly 2 decades, Algerian officials could claim European rights for their goods and perhaps their people. Finally, and only in 1976, did the EEC put into writing a new relationship with Algeria. Algeria's exit from Europe was slow and halting, to say the least. Despite maintaining some labor and commercial relations, now Algeria would be treated as a third country like any other. The agreement made no reference to French Algeria or to Article 227, which had explicitly named Algeria within the EEC's geographic reach. Unspoken was the reality that Algeria itself had once figured into France's, and thus Europe's, administrative and territorial equation. A little more Philly ambiance. So, the European Economic Community became a Europe of nation states slowly and haltingly. That this transition proved incomplete until at least 1976, 14 years after Algeria's independence, demonstrates how long-lasting and deeply ingrained assumptions about Europe's, and especially France's, role in former colonial holdings would be. In 1974, Algerian Foreign Affairs Minister Abdelaziz Bouteflika addressed the EEC via a press conference, and here he is pictured surrounded by microphones a few years earlier. He declared, quote, "Because I speak in the name of Algeria, it should be recalled that France signed the Treaty of Rome considering Algeria to be an integrated part of France, and by consequence, legally and historically, we Algerians would have had the same rights as any other member of the European community." Bouteflika's use of the conditional past tense speaks to futures never realized. After over a century of declaring Algeria French and years of claiming it as European, the French abandoned their visions of Algérie française and then of Algérie européenne. So I'll start to conclude here. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. But I opened today with Gerd Figa, the polio-stricken Hanoverian, whose right to receive a pension for his years in Algeria was affirmed by the European Court of Justice in an acknowledgement of the inescapable liabilities of the post-independence period. Figa's case, together with 2 similar cases, one concerning another German, the other concerning a Belgian national, are collectively known as the Algerian cases. These cases attest to the long-term implications of Algeria's former juridical status within both France and the EEC. While French social security offices guaranteed support for their own citizens who had worked in Algeria prior to independence, they felt no such obligation to other Europeans. Those workers' home states in turn took the opportunity to emphasize that Algeria had never been a part of Europe, which, as I have shown today, was an ahistorical assertion. The result was a small cohort of people who had to prove that they had, in fact, moved within the borders of Europe when they worked in Algeria. The Algerian cases reinforced the reality that Europe's borders were not fixed at the founding of the EEC. And as recently as 2013, the EU's European Economic and Social Committee cited the Algerian cases as precedent, mandating the equal treatment of member state workers beyond the EU's borders. There is much more to integrated Europe's history than the story I learned at Jean Monnet's home in Yvelines. A critical historical examination of Europe's construction does not imply a wholesale rejection of the project, but rather highlights how much more is left to explore about the roots of the European Union. This is a story that deserves to be told because it topples historical and contemporary assertions about real European identities or the natural shape of Europe. So I'll just mention one final Court of Justice case, this one concerning an Algerian worker. Tayeb Belbouab, born in 1924, worked in continental French coal mines for nearly 13 years before moving to West Germany in 1960, and I'm quoting from his court records here, to avoid possible political difficulties. While living there, Belbouab became an Algerian national as a result of independence. We can recall that legally speaking, Algerian citizenship did not exist prior to 1962. He worked in West German mines until he became eligible for a retirement pension in 1974. The German administration rejected his pension application on the grounds that he was not a European national. This would mean he could not claim his years in France to be paid by the German administration through EEC member state reciprocity. The Advocate General argued in favor of Belbouab, contending that it would be, quote, illogical and in substance discriminatory, were a worker who has lost French nationality and become Algerian to be placed in a less favorable position than foreign nationals with weaker ties to France or Europe. Because Belboab was a French national when he worked in France, he was entitled to the full European pension he demanded in West Germany. Belboab's success, however, coincided with French and West German attempts to curtail Algerian immigration, which culminated in labor recruitment freezes in 1974 and 1973, respectively. Thus, while Belboab found satisfaction, many of his fellow citizens did not. So, was Algeria ever actually the seventh member state of the European Economic Community? EEC officials certainly could envision Algerian land as a part of Europe. Algerian people complicated this picture. As much as Algeria's links to the EEC suggest a history of what could have been, ultimately my book chronicles why the integration process came to shut out Algeria. Nevertheless, Algeria's European years invite us to imagine a world where so-called European identity is not taken as a given, in which communities of color and Muslim people living across Europe are not treated as racialized others in need of an education to become European. By birthright, they may have been European all along. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was incredibly fascinating. And I think, as you rightly point out, something that I think many of us who think about and work on contemporary European Union don't often think about this period in history. So this was really fascinating. So I know we have already one question, but if you, for those in the audience, feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A or chat. And if you would like to ask your question yourself, as opposed to me channeling your question, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and turn on your camera as well. I will take my privilege as moderator to ask the first question while others are collecting their thoughts. As I said, this was incredibly fascinating and just got me thinking about so many different things. The one thing that, and in fact, you kind of brought this up a bit at the end, is I wonder that, you know, obviously you're telling very much this story of elites, right? And the Algerian elites who very much wanted to become, as post 62, part of the EEC. And I'm curious about sort of the average Algerian and what both their sort of understanding of this relationship was, and if there's any sense of, you know, if there was this desire among the Algerians themselves, not necessarily the Pied Noir, but the Algerians themselves, to become, you know, the seventh member state as well, or some version of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So after 62, I would qualify the Algerian government's desire to be in the EEC even. I think it is better to say that it was one of many different international formations that they were very interested in being a part of. So being in Europe did not track very well with an FLN version of a liberation history. So a great example of this is wine. So at the same time, literally overlapping, so in the 60s until the early 1970s, at the same time that Algerian officials are pushing the EEC to recognize the rights that they're owed thanks to the Treaty of Rome, the Algerian government is also railing against the EEC's gradual killing of Algeria's wine industry. And there's some great work on that, notably by Joseph Bowling, a book that came out pretty recently. So in publications in Algeria, there's huge criticism of Algeria's wine industry that's being characterized as something imposed upon it by the past, even though there's an understanding among these Algerian officials that it could be economically beneficial to continue that wine industry through trade with Europe. So all of it is to say that I really focus on the bureaucrats, but my reading of the publications where they really talk about European wine policy in particular is that there would still be a level of disgust for what these European politicians are doing, even though simultaneously these same officials are going to Brussels and saying, hey, are we still going to work together?
Interesting. And it would be very, interesting. I'm sure there were not necessarily, there probably weren't surveys done right at the time. But that would be, sort of a fascinating window really into, even the, sort of a lower level, kind of at the grassroots level as well. And I suppose we can speculate, but.
Yeah, and I think the other, even thinking about European public opinion at the time, I think for many of us who study European integration, Brexit, for all of its stressors, has been nice because people in America finally know a little bit about integrated Europe. And that is not the case in the period that I study. Mm-hmm. So thinking about, this is a history of bureaucracy and a diplomatic history because that's what I've chosen to examine, but also, I'm really curious to see if some people are able to pull out more of that, the human side, but my impression is that there's a reason that these conversations are happening, not even at such a high level, it's such a middling bureaucratic level.
No, definitely. No, thank you. All right, well, we definitely have some activity with questions. So Gregor, do you want to unmute yourself, turn your camera on maybe?
Yes, I'm muted. I don't know how to turn my camera on. I don't see a camera symbol.
Okay, I think, here. That might be Allison, but you can, while she's doing that, you can, oops, we lost you. You can unmute yourself. Oh, there you are.
Now it works, perfect.
There we go, hi.
Hi, Megan, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. It's so fascinating to see, it's a further illustration how complex the roots of European integration just are. It's not just a story that the European Union likes to tell about itself, but it's just more complicated and has many facets. And I have a question that relates to the other European Union members, or not the EEC members at that time. And I know it's a little bit out of your own research, but maybe you encountered that. So what you presented, it sounded as if the French policy, of including Algeria first and then excluding it, that the other EEC members just conceded basically to French national interests, and just keeping France in. And did you encounter anything that they themselves thought, that France is kind of a trailblazer for basically linking their own interests in former colonies or existing colonies, and to bring in this economic cooperation? Maybe encounter anything here.
So there is a very, I would call it a quibble, not a debate in the historiography about if this is France's sort of position exclusively or if this is more pan-European. I would argue that this particular tactic is French, and that the French are doing it through a sort of desperation. In contrast, for example, the Dutch are disgusted by France's approach to demanding this type of inclusion, but that doesn't make them pioneers of anti-imperialism amongst the six. It's because they don't see an economic or political reasoning to inviting Europe into their own imperial sovereign issues. So that's where I see the French as being really distinct in this sort of grasping at this time of major change in the French Empire. The big exception, the Belgians really in 1956 are still walking hand in hand with the French for their interests in the Belgian Congo, but it does fall off. So by the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Belgium starts to be aligning itself as part of the Benelux partnership in this way and moving away from seeing itself as a partner with France in terms of the particular sort of imperial drive within negotiations. Italy is deeply unhappy for very different reasons than the Dutch. It's because some of you maybe in the audience are familiar with the sort of longer term history of the Mezzogiorno, southern Italy, and even in terms of identity formation, this concept that Southern Europe is closer to Africa and somehow less civilized in huge quotation marks than Northern Europe. And so the Italians are worried about the material benefits that they have secured going to Algerians instead of their own citizens, but there's also something in there that seems to be this fear of what if the Algerians look a little bit too much like us in terms of their needs. So it is, there are lots of European players in it, but I would argue that the French tactic is largely unique to France.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Andrew Shield has raised his hand. If you want to unmute yourself and turn your camera on, and then I think we need to work our magic and you will appear.
Yes, great. And I can even start my video. Hi, hello. So I am originally from the US, but calling in here from Europe, one of the only benefits of kind of this COVID culture. And my question is kind of about US and Europe academia. So your research is very much based in post-colonial critiques and theories, which are welcome in many institutions in the US. So I was curious, how have these conversations been received in Europe or in France? I mean, mostly informal conversations maybe, and just curious, how are French people surprised, skeptical? How do people respond to this?
Yeah, such an interesting question. I think especially for those of you who saw the Times article or who had maybe already been tapped into Macron blaming Anglo-Saxon American academia for all of the current woes in France, which is so nice to have credit for that. I have found a real openness among French academics who I've encountered with this. I don't think that I've not found pushback or concern about what I'm talking about. I think because even in Europe, of course, there's more knowledge of European integration, but it still is something that is not discussed enough. And I'd say especially among historians, it's something that seems to have been kind of meted out to other disciplines that, you know, historians can learn from, but it's generally more a curiosity. I do find though, in times when I've been, you know, some of my archives are collected by the by settler communities themselves in France. One archive that is really useful in Aix is run by people who have nostalgie, are nostalgic for Algeria, and I find that it leads to very interesting conversations where people, I think, especially because I'm American, and especially when I was younger, looked very young and impressionable when I was first doing my research, they took the opportunity to let me know that, of course, it was France and that it was just like America's Wild West. So there are really interesting, bigger conversations happening where those who have a nostalgia for that moment are trying to draw connections of the normalcy by pointing to American frontier culture, which of course is a whole other historiography. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Great, thank you. And welcome, Andrew, from the Netherlands, I think, is where you are currently. Yes, this is one of the wonderful things, wonderful, I don't know if I can say wonderful about COVID, but one of the, we sort of joke about making lemonade out of lemons, right? That one can join all sorts of, come into all sorts of programs from wherever you are and not bound by space. Unfortunately, that also means that Megan cannot be here in person, and I would love to be able to welcome you to Pittsburgh at some point in person, but maybe the good and the bad. Okay, so we have some questions that that have come in the chat that I can just read. So the first one is from Adam Shear, who's a colleague here in religious studies. And he asks, I was intrigued by the quotation from the Italian labor minister who referred to the Algerian workers as Muslims, quote Muslims. Do you find a lot of other rhetoric that emphasize difference, otherness in terms of religion?
No, that is like a novelty quote in my book. I think it's amazing how consistent the language is, and that is the consistency of not saying certain things. It's one of the only times that I saw the word Muslim in my research at all. Another vocabulary word or words that essentially next to never came up was war. So the Algerian War is never mentioned in my archives, any of the archives that I visit. And that's despite, you know, these being missives coming out of the same ministries that would have been writing about the war. And they might not have called it the war, but they would have called it conflict, right? Things like that. But there's an incredible silence. And so it is pretty surprising to see that word Muslim. Maybe it's less surprising that it's being uttered by not a French person, so that there is just a more explicit expression of exactly what is feared. What is interesting, and is something that I've had to puzzle out in my book, is that there are episodes where the France's partners are saying, you know, people from Algeria, and it's a blanket term where, because of the citizenship regime expanded after World War II, it's no longer clear if they can be just referring to the settlers or if they are referring to everybody. So there's one episode where people from Algeria and France's other overseas departments will not be included in a labor migration stipulation. And there's a discussion amongst French bureaucrats that this might lead to some people from Algeria, i.e. settlers, potentially bringing cases to the Court of Justice for being treated unfairly. But it's pretty clear that there's this idea that it's maybe worth risking that because it will prevent at least unspoken Muslims from moving to Europe. So no, it almost never comes up.
Great. Okay, so we have a question from Simon Jackson, who, if I'm correct, is joining us from Birmingham in the UK, another COVID beneficiary, I suppose. I don't believe I just said that, but anyways. So he says, thanks for a great talk. Further to the point about the wine industry, I was curious about Brussels as a forum for lobbying by corporations in this period, and how much lobbying may have played into the interstate diplomatic politics you've analyzed. I was wondering, for example, about oil and gas interests and how they may have lobbied separately to states.
Yeah, that is such a great question. I really don't have an answer. I know Simon's work and he knows mine, and my second project maybe is going to be about infrastructure between Europe and Africa from pre-independence to post. I really don't know. I think it's a great question. I can just use the wine example again to say that lobbying is critical in that example. It's lobbies from specific regions in continental France and in Italy that in some ways are working together to push their governments to make certain changes in Brussels. So lobbying, and this is all from Joseph Wolling's work, lobbying can be to blame or traced as a resultant death of Algeria's wine industry, as much as Algeria's government also wanted to step away from that being a major part of the economy. It's those lobbyists. So I think that's a great question, but it's not one I can answer.
Okay, Chelsea Shields has raised her hand. So Chelsea, if you want to unmute yourself and turn your camera on. Oh, there's a very cute dog picture there.
I don't see an option to show my camera, so you might have to stare at my dog for
okay, I think if your camera's on, I think we can enable it, but you can start talking and we will. This is like the guy with the cat a few days ago. Right?
So thank you, Megan, for this wonderful talk. I learned so much. And as someone who's followed this project, I'm always struck by the depth of your documentation, which stands in such stark contrast to our general ignorance about this history of Algeria's former inclusion in the EEC. So I guess my question is a bit broader. I would love to hear you reflect on why this history is not known or conventionally written about in integration histories. Is this a matter of kind of Pierre Nora, like repression and forgetting? Is it a matter of archival blinders? You mentioned that, there are archives in Florence that many integration historians go to, but there are also these more national, like overseas department archives. Or is it a matter of kind of entrenched historiographical narrative? So I would just love to hear you reflect on that. And thank you again for sharing with us.
Thanks. Yeah, that is a great question coming from your dog. I would say, so I alluded to this very early on in my talk, but there is a lot of work, I mean, not in comparison to some other topics, but there is comparative to this Algerian history, which I would say there's next to nothing. There's a lot of work by historians on the associated African states in Madagascar. So I mean, the term that the French would have used would have been Afrique Noire, Black Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa. But some of the work that I want to do is to push against allowing that to be some sort of firm divide, because it's quite clear from this that, especially with the Treaty of Rome, by virtue of what they were demanding for Algeria, the remainder of France's empire was also impacted by that. So it does matter to not accept France's geographic and administrative separation of parts of Africa, but to think about this Algerian history as part of Africa's broader history with integrated Europe. That said, why does a lot of the historiography focus on the associated African states and Madagascar? There's a lot more treaties, and they happened a lot earlier. So there's Yaoundé in 1963, there's subsequent Yaoundé Accords, and there's Lomé Accords that sort of take over and are even more expansive in the early 1970s. So there's a lot of evidence of these connections that are a lot more obvious because there's these treaty dates over and over again with pretty firm connections to development aid and more. And I think that invites more examination because it's so clearly an object that needs to be examined. And that spills over into just French national history. Some of you might be familiar with the term France-Afrique. Maybe when I said Euro-Africa, which in French is Eurafrique, you were thinking, I do know about this, but it's France-Afrique. There's also an entire study about, even to this day, former French colonies, mainly not North African, connecting to France through bureaucracy. There's a lot of work on this. So I think that is why the focus has been away from Algeria. And then also, there's so much Algerian history to write about unwriting its history as being part of France. The idea that the War of Independence could have been considered a war of secession, right? Because it was literally part of France. There's so much work to do to unpack that meaning. And so I wonder if that also then makes this sort of strange and not immediately visible connection between Algeria and Europe less obvious to people as they're setting out in the archives. It wasn't what I thought I was going to find in the archives when I began research. It's really what I came to by seeing what was in the documentation in front of me.
Sorry, my unmute was not working. So this is a related question from Pernilla, and she writes, thanks for a wonderful talk. And she says, as I listened, I kept thinking about the parallel processes of integration that involved the colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, et cetera, that became overseas departments and remain so today. Are these parallel processes brought into discussions over the question of Algeria and Euro-Afrique as well?
Yes, so I have found that, so my book essentially ends in 1976 with that cooperation agreement, which I see as a pretty firm bookend in these Algerian-European relations I'm tracking. And I find that the real then question about what to do with the remaining overseas departments actually is a matter for the after, because I would contend that these stipulations that have included Algeria almost incidentally include the remaining overseas departments that are in the Caribbean and also La Réunion in the Indian Ocean. That said, in my conclusion, I do reflect on what the meaning is for those spaces to some degree. I actually can share my screen again because I have a bonus footage. Let's see if this works. Yes, so it's not the most recent, but it gives a pretty good sense of all of the places that Europe kind of is today, right, with an asterisk. And you'll see, of course, that we recall that the age of decolonization is in theory now many decades behind us, but this presence continues to this day. So what I found for the overseas departments that remained, so not Algeria, is that there's these incredibly uncomfortable questions about whether people from other, I'll stop my share now, whether people from other members of integrated Europe can work there for how long. And there are these, there's friction because on the one hand, and I think this is related to the situation in Algeria, there's a desire to, most importantly, protect France's interests wherever those interests that may be. And on the other hand, to be friendly with their European partners. So there's an episode, I think it's from the late 1960s, where there are these German mechanics, West German mechanics, who moved to La Réunion with their wives, and they try to renew their visa and they're denied. And the West German foreign minister is complaining to Paris about this mistreatment of just these two mechanics. It's fascinating to think about, a couple of auto mechanics creating such a stir. But the French side with Réunion's decision not to renew these visas, the explanation being that these Germans should have had time to train local men in these jobs. And so we see this example where the French are privileging local jobs, the local economy, and perhaps also trying to stave off unrest in what remains of an empire, putting that over the sort of German concern in this case.
Okay, Allison had a follow-up question. I think she'll unmute herself and reappear.
Oh, the magic.
Look at that.
I can also make myself big. So
the power.
Yeah. So my question was actually really similar to Pernella's, and it might go down the same area, but just drawing off of what you just said, I was struck by one of the things that that I am continually struck by when I read communications that kind of go out and are supposed to impact the entire European Union. And sometimes they'll start with this language, which has become almost boilerplate of, impacting all the areas of the EU. And I'm just paraphrasing here, but with the exception of the, overseas departments that are territories for obvious reasons, comma, and then it doesn't state what those 4 obvious reasons are. And I'm always sort of like, but no, I think there could be more to that. So my question was sort of thinking through how impactful maybe this Algeria case that you've just told us about, this example was on the other DOMs later, which you were just sort of mentioning. And I'm thinking through a lot of the stuff I was looking at in the archives recently, where it was clear that the French we're still trying to play both sides for the 60s, 70s, and throughout to hoping that those overseas departments could maybe benefit from development funds, which are set aside for, third countries, but also have protective, have their goods protected so that, newly independent African nations are not undercutting them with banana sales or whatever, those kinds of things. So I think it's interesting how that might have developed, and you've sort of already addressed that, but if there's anything more.
Yeah, I mean, it was in this talk, and then I realized it's so nitty gritty for those who are less obsessed with French administration, but I can definitely give lots more details to Allison. But the French officials knew that Algeria comprised departments. That wasn't like a secret, and yet they were allowing Algeria prior to independence to be referred to in some cases as territory. Defebvre, the overseas French minister, Algeria didn't fall under the purview of his ministry, yet he was there talking about it as lumping it in with the territories to gain these benefits. And then it gets split, but only after that becomes so pressing. So I think that there's something really fascinating and wild about all of these times, all of these examples where the French, of course they know, right? They've all gone to these elite schools of bureaucracy. They know where their different administrations apply, but they are hedging. And so then that comes to include the idea that they start, in the case of Algeria, demanding things that they promised would only be applying in the continental European territory. They start saying, no, we want that for Algeria. And then things that should not apply to locations that are part of France, right? Places that are literally independent, perhaps, that they do want similar stipulations to protect those places too. And you're completely right. It's because, and for people who study, these regions today, France is controlling how these economies work. So these places are, for example, potentially have costs of living that are much higher than their neighboring islands. And so that's extremely troubling. So they need that protection. So to be undercut by all of these, economies nearby could spell disaster for France's control over these areas. So continuing to have this push and pull of wanting to keep the European partners happy and wanting to maintain some sort of semblance of economic security and French sovereignty in these other places, it's a tension that I think really matters and definitely goes beyond Algeria.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. This is also so fascinating. So I think I have covered all the questions. I will have one final question. So I'm just curious. So you mentioned this project bookend in sort of 1970. And I'm just curious if you're thinking, of a sort of subsequent project looking kind of beyond and what's developed since then, or where things are going sort of from a research perspective post this project.
Yeah, so I'm actually, my next project is not taking this further into time. It's going to a very strange example that comes up fairly early in my book, which is, this concept of Eurafrica that I mentioned a couple times, this interwar dream of the continents of Africa and Europe fused together. In the interwar, the vision of Eurafrica tends to really be emphasizing that Africa will be leading Africa as a sort of head, Europe as the head, Africa as the body. Later, after World War II, there's some ideas of brotherhood where they will be brothers in this Eurafrica together. But I found this example in the archives of a group, and so Eurafrica matters, speaking of lobbying in the history of European integration, because it could be this Eurafrica, right, where we literally see integrated Europe unifying together in Europe and then also through their work together in Africa. And so I found this association called the Friends of Eurafrica and the Sahara publishing sort of bulletins about this. And then I discovered that they also ran a car race every 2 years from Algiers to Cape Town, a car race to introduce wealthy auto enthusiasts to the glory of all of Europe's colonial endeavors across all of Africa. So this has led me to be really interested in histories of infrastructure and this sort of idea of this ideology of Eurafrica, now not in the bureaucratic stage, but in a stage of sort of ideology and action. So tentatively, that is my new project. I did do some preliminary research in that, and I've had one article come out, but it's on a bit of a hiatus because there's only so much work that I can do archivally on that topic from Philadelphia. But I do think that there's something very interesting about this attempt to move Eurafrican ideology from Brussels, where, and actually this maybe gets back to your first question, where it's the Eurafrica that seems to be all about bureaucrats and technocrats doing their jobs, into a Eurafrica that is exciting to the masses. I'm thinking about how that idea might be sold, is something that I'm really curious about.
That's really interesting and I think this is, kind of gets to so much of the, kind of the history of the European project, is how you, sort of bring in the population, right? You make this less of, less of a bureaucratic endeavor, and and this is, as we know, of course, talk a lot about the democratic deficit within the EU. And so we're, sort of seeing that too, is how you win over hearts and minds. And this is, in a different context as well. Well, we are just, I think, about at the end of our time. I want to thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and I think really generated a lot of wonderful questions and got everyone thinking. To those in the audience, we're going to put a survey up in the chat momentarily. So if you could take a couple of minutes just to fill that out, that's very helpful. There's also a link for students if you're to get global credit for this. And I also want to mention an event next week at almost the same time. We seem to be having lots of events around noon on Thursday, which is continuing our Conversations on Europe series, focused on creating Europe. And we will be focusing on the creating Europe through the built environment, and other policy, and both from an architectural perspective, but also from various EU policies, like the cohesion policy and things like that. So the link for that is in the chat as well. And if you are available, I'd encourage you to join us for that. But thank you again, Megan, for joining us. And thanks to everyone, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much.